Okay, so it's good afternoon from where I'm sitting, and I think it's good morning or midday from Australia, and it's already Sunday over there. So it's really nice to be here and to be part of this special 40 Days of Peace due to Martin Luther's King's commemoration. And I'm here representing the Charter for Compassion. And I'm very, very pleased to present here Madonna Quixley, well, and Tim Hollo and David Hartsough and Gem Romuld and Lynn Reader, who have come together with this wonderful presentation for us all. And I'm going to pass the word on to Madonna, who is let me get my notes so I don't get this wrong, but National Coordinator of the Peace Sector in Australia and co-founder of Let's Talk Peace Ballarat. So,
Thanks, Merida.
thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for that introduction, and welcome one and all. So I'm offering this greeting from Wadawurrung country near Ballarat, Australia, and acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, part of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and to come, and to all First Nations peoples present, acknowledging the ongoing connection to country and custodianship of First Nations people to country and waterways. So today we're marking the third anniversary of the coming into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as part of, as Merida mentioned, the Martin Luther King Jr. 40 Days of Peace. And our forum is themed Turning the Dream of Peace into Action, One Compassionate Step at a Time. So we've partnered with ICANN, World Beyond War, all the various levels of Charter for Compassion, global, local, and also Compassionate Ballarat, so very local. And so to bring you these three peace builders, Gem Romuld from ICANN Australia, the extraordinary lifelong activist David Hartsough, co-founder of Nonviolent Peace Force and World Beyond War, and Tim Hollo, whose book Living Democracy provokes readers to ponder the practice of peace within an ecological framework. There'll be an opportunity to put questions to the speakers after they've all spoken. So please put your questions in the chat box, and as time permits, we'll do our best to answer them. And I just want to reiterate that we're very grateful to the speakers for giving so freely their time and expertise today. And just a little housekeeping thing to please remember to keep your microphones on mute for now. So we're going to start off with Gem Romuld to report on the recent meeting of states parties to the TPNW. Gem is recipient of a 2021 Peace Women Award from WILF Australia, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, currently working with ICANN Australia to ensure the Australian government signs and ratifies the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. She's a member of Quit Nukes, a campaign for Australian financial institutions to exclude nuclear weapons producing companies. Over to you, Gem.
Thanks very much, Madonna. Great to be here. I was interested in finding out where everyone is from today, so I know how much Australian content to include in my short chat at the beginning here. Can you feel free to put in the chat? There's one person from Ireland, or come off mute and just tell me where you are. Canada, California. I'm calling from Dharawal country, so Wollongong, about an hour south of Sydney in Australia. All right, we've got quite the international audience. That's great. So I won't give you too much Australian content, even though that's really sort of what we're working on here. But yeah, there's a few US joining. Okay, good. Well, can I ask, are you all familiar with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Have you at least heard of it? You know a little bit about it? Okay, a little tiny bit. All right, I'll give a small amount of context. So the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it's the first international global agreement to comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons in a similar way to the bans on cluster munitions, landmines, biological weapons, and chemical weapons. And even though, nuclear weapons have been around since 1945, there has only been a comprehensive ban, a global ban on them since 2017, which was the process brought about in large part by governments and civil society working together to say, look, the nuclear armed states are not taking the threat of nuclear weapons seriously enough. We need to find a new strategy to stigmatize and to sort of undermine the moral authority that they claim to have in possessing these weapons that are simply weapons of mass destruction that have no legitimate place in any country's security policy. So a process came together and created this treaty in 2017. And as Madonna mentioned, 3 years ago today, that treaty reached the requisite number of ratifications to enter into force, which is hugely significant. So that means that the treaty is really, it's got a permanent place now in international law, and it is binding on all of the states parties to the treaty. And to date, there are now 70 states parties and 93 signatories, and those numbers are going up every year. So it's a really significant agreement that many people said would be impossible to get through because of the strong opposition from the nuclear armed states. But the fact is that the global majority of countries do not have or want nuclear weapons and are threatened by them. So they were able to utilise their numbers to create this new legal instrument. In our region, I think the next likely nation to ratify is Indonesia, which will be the biggest state party by population. Indonesia approved its ratification in the parliament in November. So we're really looking forward to that because that'll be particularly influential for Australia. Now, the treaty does a few things. It prohibits, the possession, the use, the threat of use, the testing, the stockpiling, the transfer, the hosting of nuclear weapons, and it also prohibits assisting or inducing or encouraging any of those activities. It's the first to set out a clear framework for the elimination of nuclear weapons. So all countries can join it and negotiate a process to actually verifiably and in a time-bound manner eliminate their stockpiles. And it's also the first nuclear weapons related treaty that has positive obligations around trying to repair some of the past harms done by nuclear weapons. So these are in Articles 6 and 7 for victim assistance and environmental remediation. And that's particularly important for countries where nuclear testing has taken place and countries that have conducted nuclear testing programs. So that's significant for us here in Australia because there was a really horrific British nuclear weapons testing program that has still left a lot of contamination and a lot of people, particularly First Nations people, suffering the intergenerational health impacts of those bombs. So international law takes time. Obviously, the nuclear armed states have not come on board yet. And our next sort of project is to really bring on board as many countries as possible, including those that have positions like Australia, where we sort of support nuclear weapons, even though we claim to be totally in favour of nuclear disarmament. So one of the beautiful things about this treaty is that it really forces every country to show their true colours and to show whether they are actually on the side of perpetuating nuclear weapons or if they're on the side of getting rid of them. So that's a difficult dilemma for Australia right now because our government is very much doing on this treaty what the US would like it to do. It's claiming to be protected by US nuclear weapons, which is, a theory that's become policy for a couple of decades now. And that's been really, this concept of nuclear deterrence providing security has become really successfully entrenched by the nuclear armed states as a justification for them to retain their weapons, in the face of international pressure. So that's our challenge here, is to make the popular opposition bigger than the current pressure on the Australian government from the US not to join this treaty. But we do have, there's a lot of support in Australia and in the Australian Parliament and in the Australian public. So it is feasible that we'll get there, and the party that's in government now, the Labor Party, actually do have a policy platform to sign and ratify, which was reaffirmed just about 6 months ago at their national conference. So even before the nuclear armed states have joined, one of the other impacts of the treaty has been to compel financial institutions worth over $1 trillion worldwide to divest from nuclear weapons producers. So that's been really wonderful to see, is the increasing unacceptability of investing in countries that have anything to do, in companies that have anything to do with the manufacturing of nuclear weapons. And that includes some super funds in Australia that have changed their positions, and some banks. I think there are a couple of banks in America that have changed their position since the treaty came into force. Now, I'll speak briefly about the second meeting of states parties, which occurred at the United Nations last November. So it was 5 days from the 27th of November till the 1st of December. And this is in the wake of the first meeting, which took place in Vienna in June in 2022. So it was the second coming together of states parties. There were around 100 countries, not just states parties, but also governments that were observing the proceedings, and that includes Australia and other countries that are interested in the treaty and have a lot of public pressure on them to join the treaty, but are not ready to do that yet, and that includes Germany, Belgium, and Norway. Now, part of the treaty is, of course, sort of looking at how it's going, how can it be progressed, what can the states parties do to make it work effectively and to bring more states on board. They've set up a structure of working groups that meet between each meeting, and a scientific advisory group which presented their first report at the meeting, which looks at basically the current threat posed by nuclear weapons and the current risks that they present. And I'll put a link in the chat to that report soon. One of the new things that came up at this meeting was a new strategy to actually take on this concept of nuclear deterrence and extended nuclear deterrence as a theory that is essentially getting in the way of making progress on disarmament. And this is for the states parties to basically pull together all of their arguments about their security interests, and then to form a strategy to promote their security interests as being human-centered, collective-centered, environment-centered, and being security interests that do not foresee any role for nuclear weapons. There was a really strong focus at this meeting on the impacts of nuclear weapons, and a lot of representatives of communities affected by nuclear weapons use and testing were there and were presenting to the conference. So people from the Marshall Islands, from Australia, from French Polynesia, all gave really powerful interventions about what the impact of nuclear weapons is on their communities today, and what they want to see the states parties doing to try to put these articles to work to make amends for victim assistance and environmental remediation. So overall, it was a really positive, strong meeting. I won't go into any more detail because we'll be here, I'll take up the full hour, but it was really special to be in this conference room surrounded by countries that actually take nuclear disarmament seriously and are formulating strategies and are really committed to seeing change in this area, because there's pretty much no other nuclear weapons agreement that's going well. The ban treaty is really the key light on the horizon for seeing change in this arena, and it will take time, but it's got great potential, and it's really exciting to be part of that. So the next meeting of states parties will be actually next year in 2024, around March at the UN, and that'll be hosted by Kazakhstan. And our project in Australia is, of course, to have Australia there as a state party ideally, but at least as a signatory. So I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Gem. That was great. Sorry we didn't have more time to hear more about it, but yeah, no, thank you very much. So we'll go over to David Hartsough now, who's an American Quaker peace activist and co-founder of the Nonviolent Peace Force. David's parents were active in the peace movement, and he embarked on his life's work after actually meeting Martin Luther King Jr. Is involved in the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements and worked for 18 years for peace and justice with the American Friends Service Committee. He's engaged in nonviolent peacemaking in the US, Kosovo, the former Soviet Union, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Iran, and Palestine and Israel. David is Executive Director of Peace Workers, also co-founder of World Beyond War. And with Joyce Holiday, he co-authored a book, his memoir, basically, Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist. And he's also received the USF Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice 2021 Clarence B. Jones Award in Kingian Nonviolence. So David will now share his experiences with Martin Luther King and how that compassionate approach affects his views and actions on the TPNW, Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and peace work in general. Over to you, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madonna, and for inviting me. And thanks to Gem for your great work and on the treaty to abolish all nuclear weapons. And thanks to all of you from different parts of the world, including Australia. I want to thank you for your lives and your work in the Charter for Compassion, working for a more compassionate, just, and peaceful world. All of us around the world are brothers and sisters and children of God. War and killing one another because we do not like another country's government is a crime against humanity. In facing the enormity of the problem of war and threats of war, and even using nuclear weapons, I think it's the importance of hope, that we can make a difference, is so very important. And it was because of that that I wrote my book, Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist. And what I'd like to do this evening is to share some of the stories from my life, which can hopefully be helpful to others in working for a more just, compassionate, and peaceful world. I'll share some of these stories. I had the good fortune, my father took my brother and me to Montgomery, Alabama in 1956 during the Montgomery bus boycott, where almost the total African-American population of Montgomery was boycotting the buses, which was their primary means of transportation, challenging the segregation. It was the law of the land at that time. And each day they had to wake up an hour earlier to walk to work rather than to ride the segregated buses. And when Black churches were bombed, instead of bombing white churches, they got together and helped rebuild the Black churches and said, and this was with the leadership of Martin Luther King, the white folks, the white racists are not our enemy. They are also our brothers. And King, I think, was such a gift to the human race. The depth of his love and his compassion, his commitment to working for a more just and peaceful world is what he devoted his whole life to and what he died for. And that, as a young 15-year-old, that was a pretty powerful experience for me. And King had welcomed us as young boys from the North coming to learn about their struggle. Well, partly inspired by my time with King and my visit to Montgomery, Alabama, I went to Howard University, which was an African American university in Washington, D.C. And while I was there, 4 students in Greensboro, North Carolina, African American students, decided to go to the local drugstore, which was segregated, and to try to get something to eat. And instead of getting something to eat, they were arrested and went to jail. And when they got out of jail, they came back again. That was a spark to young African American people all across the United States that there's something we can do to challenge this racist, horrendous system that is really killing us and treating us as second-class citizens. Well, at Howard University, we found out that in both Maryland and Virginia, all the drugstores and eating facilities outside of Washington, D.C. were still so totally segregated. So a bunch of us, integrated group, went out to Maryland every Saturday morning and would get arrested and spent the weekends in jail singing freedom songs. And we'd get out Monday morning and go back to class until the next week. The state of Virginia had passed a law saying anybody that challenged segregation in Virginia could get 6 months in jail and a $500 fine. So we kept going to Maryland for most of that spring. But after our final exams in June, we decided somebody has to challenge this. The American Nazi Party, their leader lived in Northern Virginia and was threatening violence against anybody that challenged segregation. Well, we did some additional nonviolent training and went into a so-called People's Drugstore to get something to eat. And instead of getting something to eat, they closed the lunch counter and gave us nothing to eat or drink. But they decided not to call the police. They didn't want to get the publicity. So we sat there for 2 days waiting for something to eat. And it was the most challenging 2 days of my life. People spat in our face. They put firecrackers down our shirts. They punched us in the stomach so hard we would fall on the floor, and then they would kick us. And each time something like this would happen, we would try to respond in a loving, nonviolent way. And toward the end of the second day, I heard someone come up from behind me and he said, "If you don't get out of this store in 2 seconds, I'm going to stab through your heart." And in his hand was a switchblade, which by that time was half an inch from my heart. And I had 2 seconds to decide, do I really believe in nonviolence, or is there a better way to deal with this guy filled with hatred? And I just looked at him in the eyes and said, "Friend, do what you believe is right, but I'll still try to love you." And it was the most amazing experience of my life. Instead of stabbing me with the heart with his knife, his hand began to drop and his jaw began to fall, and he left the store, which for a young 20-year-old guy was a pretty powerful experience about the power of nonviolence. Well, we went to the front door of this People's Drugstore late that evening and read a statement appealing to the religious and community leaders of Arlington to get their influence on the business leaders to open eating facilities to everybody. And then we said what was very difficult. We said, if nothing changes, we'll be back in a week. And some friendly media people got us out alive, got us back to Howard, and we literally shook for 6 days whether we had the courage to go back and do this again. And on the 6th day, we got a phone call that the religious and community leaders had met and talked with the business leaders and got a commitment to open all the eating facilities in Arlington within 10 days. Well, this was the most important lesson of my life. That when something terrible is happening, instead of cursing the television set or the president or segregation or war, you find some other people that believe as deeply as you do in something, get some nonviolent training, and go out and challenge that injustice or that violence. And that's what I've been doing most of my life. And those are the stories I tell in my book. Well, I'd like to share just a few of the other experiences. I studied in 1961, when the United States and the Soviet Union were threatening nuclear war over Berlin. I studied in East and West Berlin on both sides at the same time. And in East Berlin, I'd hear all this communist propaganda. And when I would challenge that propaganda, they called me a capitalist warmonger. When I went to West Berlin and heard all this anti-communist propaganda, I challenged that propaganda, and they called me a communist conspirator. And of course, the newspapers on both sides gave 180 degrees different perspective on what was happening in Berlin and the world. And I learned that, unfortunately, our governments instill in us this misinformation, this lies, propaganda, into mistrusting each other and even hating each other. When, if we chose, we could just get together, live together in peace. Well, as I say, the US and Russia were threatening nuclear war that summer. And I found out that you could go camping in the Soviet Union. So I got 5 other students and traveled in our VW Bug, 6,000 miles through Russia, camping and just meeting ordinary Russian people, and learning that people in Russia wanted peace as much as we did. And it was our governments that were the problem. And somehow we have to get over these lies that are and misinformation that our governments are passing on us. Well, during the Vietnam War, when the United States started bombing Hanoi and Haiphong, a bunch of us in Philadelphia, where I was living, had a worship service and tried to picture the pain of the families living under those bombs in Hanoi and Haiphong. And the fear of whether the children would still be alive in the morning or whether the parents would still be alive. And we decided somehow we have to put our lives between these bombs and the people of Vietnam. And we found out that in Leonardo, New Jersey, there were ships loading with bombs every week headed for Vietnam. So we got some canoes and actually blockaded this first ship. It was called the USS Nitro. And we were out there every day for 7 days. On the 7th day, it was totally loaded, napalm, anti-personnel bombs, the whole rest of it. And we were right in front of that ship. And as they lifted anchor, we were paddling madly to try to stay in front of the ship. And 7 of the sailors up on the deck, high up, jumped off the ship and started swimming toward us to join our people's blockade. And that action that we did spread up and down the east and west coast of the United States, people blocking armed ships and aircraft carriers with their bodies and their canoes. And when we were blocking an aircraft carrier in Virginia, at the last minute or the last hour before it left for Vietnam, 50 of the sailors went AWOL, refusing to go on that ship on its deathly mission to Vietnam. And that led to that. I mean, I feel our courage gave courage to these 7 sailors, and our courage gave courage to these 50 sailors. And that word about that spread around the world. And within weeks, resistance within the military to fighting that war really increased very significantly. So, and if you've seen the film Sir, No Sir, a big reason that war ended was that the American soldiers were no longer willing to fight it. How am I doing on time? Is that, how much time do I have?
Yeah, you're pretty much to the end.
Oh, no.
If you've got...
Well,
you can go for a couple of more minutes if you like. If Tim's okay with that, yeah.
Well,
I think we all want to hear.
I'm going to have
so
to do
inspiring.
this very quickly. So we found out in Central America and in the Philippines that when people were threatened by death squads, if people from other parts of the world actually came and were present with them, the people in the death squads did not kill people. And that was an example of the power of international accompaniment. And that was the beginning of the Nonviolent Peace Force that now have hundreds of people in war zones in different parts of the world to try to stop the killing of civilians. And most of the people that are killed in wars today are civilians. And later, President Eisenhower had said, I like to believe that people want peace so much that governments will have to get out of the way and let them have it. Well, from my experience, and I'm sure your experience, most people do not want war. We do not want half of our federal tax dollars going to modernizing our nuclear weapons and funding military bases around the world. And they want peace. So I helped co-found World Beyond War, which now has people in 195 countries around the world. They're committed to working actively to try to stop all wars. And I'd invite you to go to the World Beyond War website and sign the pledge to work nonviolently to end war. And you'll find all kinds of resources of what can be helpful to you. Well, as was mentioned, we're at greatest danger of nuclear war than we've ever been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Any of our wars, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Israel-Palestine, whether it's with Iran or with North Korea or with China, where we're actually going full throttle ahead, risking nuclear war and all life on our planet. Because of course, if we have a nuclear war, we'll also have nuclear winter, and most people will die of starvation. So, I mean, the question for all of us, I think, is why, for any reason whatsoever, would we risk all human life on our planet, or 95% at least of all life on our planet, for any reason whatsoever, because we don't like the government of another country or want to achieve security, what kind of security is that? So as has been said, the only real security is to abolish all nuclear weapons. And I'm so grateful for ICANN and for all the people around the world that are working for that. And the US, finally, just one comment on US and Australia. The US is building military bases and military alliances surrounding China. We are getting ready for a major war with China. And instead of putting our money and our resources into how to stop climate change, working for climate solutions, we're both putting our energy and our money and our intelligence into preparing for war with each other. And that has to stop. And I pray and I hope that Australia will have the good sense to say no to the US effort to prepare for this war with China, which will could be the end of all of us. So thanks again for this opportunity to share with you. And I'm sorry my time has gone so fast, but thank you for all you're doing. And together, I do believe that we're going to create the world of compassion and justice and peace, and what King called the beloved community, which will be the real security for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Brilliant, so inspiring. The other thing that David didn't get a chance to mention was how much he has lived his whole life trying to not support the war effort, even as much as living beyond a certain level so that he didn't pay taxes and all the complicated things that he did, so that the proportion of taxes that he would have gone to, those trillions of dollars for weapons, he tried to circumvent that in many, many ways throughout his life. So I just really applaud David for his congruence, principles that he's put into practice in his own life. And so he's also very kindly given us a link to the book, which will come out to you with the recording. So this will give you an opportunity to have a listen to a lot more of those experiences that he shared today. Thanks again, David. That's wonderful.
Thank
so
you.
I'd just like to hand over. Oh, fantastic. I'd like to hand over to Tim Hollo. He's the Executive Director of the Green Institute and highly respected environmentalist, a musician, has worked with organisations including the Greens, Greenpeace, 350.org and others, as well as performing in venues from Woodford Folk Festival, which is an Australian thing here, to New York's Carnegie Hall. Tim is founder and executive director of Green Music Australia, served as communications director for a Greens politician, has sat on the board of Greenpeace Australia Pacific, and has published in various newspapers and media outlets here, The Guardian, ABC and elsewhere. So Tim will now talk about his book, especially his chapter on practicing peace and how his ideas and experiences relate to the topic at hand. Over to you, Tim. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Madonna. Thanks very much for the invitation to come and take part in this event today. And big thanks to Gem and David for your wonderful work and your inspiring presentations. My role, I guess, I think in this session is to firstly put a little bit of a philosophical kind of lens over the top of it from an ecological perspective, and then to kind of challenge us to think about one of the what I think is one of the core challenges when we're thinking about a world beyond war, which is the challenge of a world made up of nation states, and how we think about that. But I want to start with, sorry, this has just asked me to confirm that I'm speaking in French, and I don't think I am. although I could peut-être. I'm actually speaking in English. I hope. So yeah, my book Living Democracy, which came out, oh, it's not going to let me show it, came out a little over a year ago now, and the audiobook came out late last year, which you can all find, is an attempt to articulate an ecological view of the world and of how we can actually turn the poly crisis that we face, whether it be, as David was just talking about, the intersection of the climate crisis and war and the threat of nuclear war and geopolitical crises, democratic crises, how we can turn that around through living into being from our communities up, an ecological, interdependent, connected world. A world that understands that everything is connected, and that our future, our lives, our health, our happiness, our capacity to thrive all depend on understanding that everything is connected and that everything in its grand, wonderful diversity is connected, appreciating diversity as well as interdependence. And that's really the view that I bring to the question of peace and non-violence. That fundamentally, from that perspective, in my view, peace is essentially about appreciating coexistence. Peace is about respecting and appreciating our fundamental interdependence. And that, in a sense, violence is the opposite of that. Violence is about disconnecting from each other. Violence is about not understanding our interdependence and believing that we can separate each other from ourselves, from the natural world we live in. And this being an event that is marking and celebrating the extraordinary work of Martin Luther King, I think it's important to recognize how deeply he understood that and appreciated that. There's a wonderful line that I'm sure all of you know from his letter from Birmingham jail, where he wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." It's that appreciation of interdependence and mutuality that I think is absolutely core to Kingian nonviolence, to Gandhian nonviolence, and to all nonviolent action. I also want to quote from, I think, one of the most powerful explanations, beautiful and direct explanations of this idea that I've found is from the wonderful David Graeber, who was the late great David Graeber, a wonderful anarchist, activist, and writer, who wrote that violence is perhaps the only form of human action that holds out even the possibility of having social effects without being communicative. To be more precise, violence may be the only way it is possible for one human being to do something which will have a relatively predictable effect on the actions of a person about whom they understand nothing. In pretty much any other way in which you might try to influence another's actions, you must at least have some idea about who you think they are, who they think you are, what they might want out of the situation, their aversions and proclivities and so forth. Hit them over the head hard enough, and all of this becomes irrelevant. And to me, this is just such a crucial and beautiful encapsulation of the point of nonviolence, that it's about trying to understand each other, trying to build relationality, trying to cultivate that connection, understanding each other's common humanity, understanding that we're all woven into that garment of destiny. And I think pretty much every not just philosophy, but practice of nonviolence around the world is about that in some ways. It's certainly so deeply embedded, I think, in all of David's work. Nonviolent Peace Force is just such a tremendously powerful example of what that is about. It's about putting front and center in our very behavior our common humanity, showing each other our common humanity, and asking those who we are arrayed against in some way and seeking to challenge their behavior to look into our eyes and see our common humanity, and challenging them. That story that you told, David, about your experience in the desegregating the drugstore is just such an extraordinary and courageous example of that, looking into each other's eyes and seeing our common humanity. That's what we are trying to do. Nonviolence is fundamentally grounded in building connection, building our interdependence. And I guess to leap from there into the second part of what I wanted to talk about just briefly, is a question of how a geopolitics built on states can actually understand and appreciate and move towards this. And my view is that it actually can't. And I want to preface what I'm about to say with saying that at the same time as this, we must not walk away from it. And the work that Gem and others at ICANN are doing on the Treaty for the for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is utterly crucial work through the United Nations, through geopolitics as it currently exists. We must not walk away from it because that's what we currently have, but also because, as is put front and center in all of that work, this is about the normative power of nation states as they currently exist, saying nuclear weapons are so evil, we must not accept them. But the nation state is an entity which is fundamentally, by design, violent. The nation state is an entity which is about coercion within its borders and against those who are outside its borders. This is fundamental to how the Westphalian nation state kind of evolved in the era of imperialism and colonialism and capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's fundamental to how we define it, how we understand it. Weber's definition of the state, which is the one that is most deeply understood to this day, is that it is the rule of men over men based on means of legitimate violence. It's this concept of the monopoly of legitimate or so-called legitimate violence. Murray Bookchin, I think, had a beautiful encapsulation of it as well, that the state is about institutionalized power that exists apart from the people and sets the people against each other in various ways. And von Clausewitz, the philosopher of war, talked about war as the continuation of politics with other means. And I think this is really highly relevant to our conversation. Because if war is the continuation of politics with other means through the nation state, which has a monopoly on violence, then this gives us a view into how politics actually is the continuation of war with other means. That adversarial politics is fundamentally violent. And I think David had some really powerful reflections on that as well, that politics as it exists today is deeply violent and adversarial. So yeah, conscious of time, I'm going to kind of weave this together briefly. In my book, I talk a lot about the crucial, incredibly brilliant philosophy of Angela Davis, where she talks about how violence weaves together at every level, that the violence of the state and interpersonal violence, policing violence, military violence, all are interwoven in various ways. And also the wonderful work and writing of the great Petra Kelly, who was one of the founders of the German Greens and a crucial voice in the peace movement. who also talked about that interweaving. But one of Petra Kelly's beautiful concepts that I want to end with is that, and let me just actually quote that, if I may. Petra Kelly wrote that we must find a way to demilitarize society itself. We call upon people everywhere never to accustom themselves, never to allow themselves to become accustomed to the idea of war and the preparation of war. We call upon people to build and develop communities of peace everywhere. And I think this, I guess, in terms of today's discussion about moving to action, the incredibly important work of ICAN towards abolishing nuclear weapons, what can we do? I believe that our most crucial task is to work on building communities of peace at our own local levels in every way, in ways which then buttress the move towards a different way of organising our politics, of organising our democracy, a more connected, compassionate, non-violent way of doing democracy at local levels, at nation levels, and at global levels. Emphasising again that the work of ICAN in building a normative structure where war and nuclear weapons are not acceptable, working at that level and this level and coming together. That, I believe, is how we can create peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's great. People have been asking in the chat for references. I'll just share screen with you now. These are this is part of the PDF that's going to be sent out to you. So you've got a whole lot of things, the audio book of Waging Peace, where you can get the ebook in Australia, the Peace Workers link that David mentioned, and also the valuable resources on World Beyond War, this global security system in particular. It's a constantly updated document, which I think fleshes out what Tim is talking about. There's also films and a whole database there, as well as, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to move this along. Oh yeah, there we go. So here's Tim's links. Anyway, this will all be coming out to you in a PDF, as well as resources, things you can do, links to ICAN and WILP, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, how you can divest your superannuation away from nuclear weapons. And there's both Australian things there that quit nukes, as well as Don't Bank on the Bomb, which is, I think, is an international resource. So, and this is the pledge that David was talking about, which is on the World Beyond War website. Here's also the 6 steps for Kingian nonviolence, and there's the details of us, so we can keep in contact. So I'm not sure whether I haven't been able to read all the if there's any questions in the chat, but can we just go around, because we are running out of time here, and just have some final words from our, unless it's like a really pressing question, because the main questions have been about the resources. Unless there's a really pressing question, let's just go around and ask everybody for a. Oh, hang on, Lynn. Go, Lynn.
That's okay. Thanks, Madonna. So my name's Lynn Reader. I'm the lead for the national lead for the Australian Compassion Council in Australia. And I was just picking up on some of the points that have been made, particularly around common humanity. Certainly one important component of compassion is a deep understanding of our common humanity. But it's not just an understanding, a capacity. These are skills that we need in today's world. And certainly some of the things we do with the Charter here in Australia, we've been working with a group in the UK called Think Equal, which is a social emotional learning program for early childhood, really trying to start at the beginning and bring it through. But I was just going to pick up on that question of common humanity and just ask David about, and Tim too, that if you think our capacity to connect with others is getting better or worse, or has it just stayed the same? I mean, I just think it's such an important part of how we're going to bring peace. But if we can't see ourselves in the other, then we're not even at a starting point. So any comments on how that may have changed, that capacity and ability may have changed, David, to start? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute, David. Yep.
Our governments continue to to dish out the propaganda about how we're different and why we need to prepare for war against each other. But I think through social media and through the internet, I mean, people are seeing live what's happening to people in Gaza. And I think that has sparked like millions of people around the world that have non-violently protesting and saying this is not acceptable in a civilized world. And I think, unfortunately, the mainstream media, at least in many, many countries, just parrot the lies or half truths that the government is passing out, is putting out. But I think for people that care, that when that it is possible to find our common humanity and say we're going to act on that belief. And the war system obviously is not working. The US is the most powerful nation in the world, but we have not won a war since the Second World War. I'm most powerful militarily. And it's really time to try something else. And I think if ever there was a time that we need to discover our common humanity, and it is now.
Look, I think that it's always there in humans, our capacity to see our common humanity and our capacity deeper than that to see our connection to the natural world and all those around us. It's there, but our political and economic system suppresses it very, very powerfully. There's a wonderful line from Emma Goldman, who said way back in the turn of the previous century, then we must never judge human nature by the behavior of people under capitalism. We are trained to be selfish and tell ourselves and each other that selfishness is natural and that we are in constant competition. That is what our political and economic system tells us to do every day. And we need to struggle against that, and we do. And I think part of the reason we have these epidemics of depression and so much mental illness is because we're fighting against that inside ourselves and between each other all the time. But it's there in terms of that beautiful question, comment, Marge, in the chat about how we best bring people together. That's the focus of my work and of my book, Living Democracy, in many ways, is exactly that. And my opinion is that it needs to start with us. It's about doing it in community together. It's about whatever we're doing in community, whether it's sharing groups or repairing groups or community gardening or community groups that are coming together to do nonviolent direct action against the systems that are killing us and our planet. In all sorts of ways, we can do these things, and we have to do it. It's about the practice, I guess, is the final comment that I'd leave it with. Learning to see our common humanity is about the practice of doing so. And the more we practice, the better we get at it.
was there anything else you wanted to say, Lynn? Okay. So we are at 1 p.m. We've done the miraculous. We've gone around the world with all these very inspirational people. I'd just like to give a chance to have each of you just one last parting message for us before we say goodbye and thank you. So, David, would you like to say a sort of tying up message for us all?
Well, I agree 100% with what Tim said. We need to build communities of peace, communities of people that really love and care one another and are going to work together and support one another in working for the world that we believe is possible. And to believe deep down in our heart, the way King and the Civil Rights Movement did, that we shall overcome. Don't give up.
Thank you, David. Gem, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think just following on, I really agree with what David and Tim have said about sort of human nature and our propensity to want to connect. I think most people, given the chance to collaborate, to be part of something bigger than them, will take it. And so I think expecting more from people and creating those opportunities, we can be really pleasantly surprised. And I think people do want to lead meaningful lives. And there's a lot that's not going well in this world, but there is huge and inspiring resistance every which way you turn. And it's usually not as visible or as vocal, definitely not as resourced as the problems that are manufactured by our capitalist economies. But it's there, and we all have a role to be part of that. And whenever I feel really overwhelmed or like, can we really do this? Wouldn't it be nice to just sort of give up? I think of this phrase that action is the antidote to despair. And really, for me, the only thing that makes me feel better is doing actually, what David, what you talked about, getting together with a group of like-minded people and strategizing, nutting it out together. What can we do to take on this particular challenge, in our community or in this country on this or that particular issue? So I just take a lot of heart from that little phrase. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here and for tuning in, and for all of the activism that you do.
Thanks, Gem. That's fantastic. Tim? Yes, big round of applause. Tim, did you want to just give your final?
Just thank you, everyone, for coming along. Thanks so much for Madonna and your colleagues for putting it on. I guess just as a final observation, one of the things that I note often in peace spaces is that they tend to be, not casting any aspersions. They tend to be older people who come along. And I just want to encourage you folks to wonderful older elders who came to talk to your children, grandchildren, younger people about this, because we need to bring the young people into the peace movement. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Lynn, did you want to say anything else?
No, just thank you, Madonna. That's been a wonderful session. Madonna, as was said at the beginning, is the national coordinator for the peace sector for the Charter in Australia, and thanks also to the Global Charter and Merida, who joined us from the US today. So thanks for everyone. Thank you. It's been a very important and inspiring session. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Madonna, can I
Thank you, Will.
Can I just interpolate, just to pass on to David, the very best wishes from Barry and Diana Pittock, who are Quakers who worked with David some decades ago. They just wanted to pass on their regards.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Madonna.